Dear President, distinguished guests, dear faculty members, and dear students, it's a great honor for us to welcome you all today to the Middle East Technical University Presidential Lecture Series. This lecture series brings together world-renowned and distinguished scientists, including Nobel laureates, with our faculty members, researchers, and students here at METU. Distinguished guests, before I invite Dr. Colglazier to the stage, I would like to inform briefly about his background. Dr. E. William Colglazier is Editor-in-Chief of Science and Diplomacy and Senior Scholar at the Center of Science Diplomacy at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He served as a fourth Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State from 2011 to 2014. From 1994 to 2011, he was Executive Officer of the National Academy of Sciences and Domestic International Sciences and National Research Council, which provide independent, objective, and scientific advice on domestic and international policy issues. From 2016 to 2018, he served as co-chair of the 10-member group appointed by the UN Secretary General to advise on science, technology, and innovation for achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals on the UN 2030 agenda. Dr. Colglazier is currently co-chair of the Global Science Diplomacy Roundtable for the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and a member of the International Advisory Board of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. He received his PhD in theoretical physics from Caltech in 1971, and prior to 1994, worked at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and the University of Tennessee. He is a past chair of the Forum Physics and Society and the Committee on International Scientific Affairs of the American Physical Society, and a fellow of ASSS and APS. In 2015, he received Joseph A. Burton Forum Award from the APS for outstanding contributions to public understanding or resolution of issues involving the interface of physics and society, and the Order of the Rising Sun, gold raised with Nike ribbon from the government of Japan for contributing to science and technology exchange and mutual understanding between Japan and the United States. Distinguished guests, now let us turn our attention to our esteemed speaker. I would like to invite Dr. Colglazier to the stage for his speech.
It's a great pleasure for me to be able to speak with all of you today. It's an honor, in fact. I've really enjoyed my visit to METU. It's a world-class university. I'm here with a team of American scientists from the U.S. government, who I think many of you know are looking for very bright ideas coming from the tremendous researchers and scholars here. They're interested potentially in helping facilitate research, including funding it. I've been to Turkey several times in my career, the first time to Ankara and to this university. So that's been extremely nice, seeing what a beautiful place it is. I'm going to talk, the title of my talk was Science Diplomacy and for a Sustainable Future. And I will try to tell you what I mean by science diplomacy. It's kind of a broad word. Different people define it differently. It's sort of like a very broad definition. But I'll tell you why I think it's important and why I think it's an important tool, not only for the scientific community, but also for our societies and governments to use it as well. These are now very interesting and exciting times for those interested in science and technology, and I'm sure all of you are quite aware of that. It's science, technology, and innovation are moving incredibly fast. We see new corporations created that no one had heard about a decade ago. We also see with some of these advances in emerging technologies, for example, artificial intelligence, gene editing, robotics, the digital revolution. They're creating great opportunities for humanity, but at the same time, they're also causing concerns and potential threats. And the fact that things are moving so fast, it's very hard to anticipate exactly how do we maximize the upsides, the opportunities, and at the same time control the downsides, the threats and disruptions that some of these advances can cause. I thought in telling you about science diplomacy, I would sort of illustrate going through several stages in my career, not really to tell you about me, but for me anyway, they illustrated several things insights that I think are quite relevant even today. When I started out in science, all I wanted to do was be a theoretical physicist. I went to Caltech in California, great, wonderful scientists there. Because I was in physics, several of the senior scientists who were mentors to me, when they were young, they had been involved in the Manhattan Project in World War II, building a nuclear weapon. Although they never served in government after that, they spent a lot of their time actually engaged in dialogues with scientists then in the Soviet Union, scientists in China. And the purpose was to try to make sure that nuclear weapons were never used again. And these dialogues that occurred back then between the scientists in these countries, when there were windows of opportunity in the diplomatic sphere, they turned out to have a large impact. In the case with the Soviet Union, these dialogues were occurring in the late 1970s and the 1980s when Gorbachev became head of the Soviet Union. It turned out his scientific advisors were those Soviet scientists, the American scientists, had been having these non-governmental dialogues with. And it led to some of the arms control agreements that occurred in the 1990s. It's not to overpromise what science engagement can do in terms of advancing relations between countries and dealing with some of these technologies that can cause such grave potential consequences if we don't deal with them well. But it does show you they can create windows of opportunity that can be used by the diplomats and leaders actually to make progress. When I got my degree in 1971, so that's now over 50 years ago, it's hard for me to believe that. Like many young scientists at that time, that was also a very monumental time in the United States as well as in the world. The U.S. was involved in the war in Vietnam. It was also the time of the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the Arab oil embargo, the energy crisis. It was the first Earth Day in the early 1970s. So a lot of young scientists, and when I talk about science, I'm including engineers, medical sciences, all the academic fields. Many of us that were younger then wanted to figure out how we could actually contribute and help make progress dealing with all of these problems that were confronting humanity at the time. And one of the programs that was created by an individual, an anonymous individual, was a program through the AAAS, where I'm now part-time, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It was a fellowship program to allow young scientists and engineers to go and get experience working in government on a fellowship for a year or two. When I was there, the fellowship was only for working on a congressional staff in the U.S. Congress. I think there were 8 of us in my class. I was in the 4th class, and this program just had its 50th anniversary. Now, this program, over the 50 years, every year there are roughly 200 to 250 young scientists, engineers who get the experience working inside the U.S. government and all the agencies, including the State Department, also still including the Congress, the legislative branch. And so they get to experience what it's like actually to be inside the government. Many of them go back to doing their careers that they were doing beforehand, but with this new knowledge. But they also, many of them actually stayed and worked inside government. The person that created this program, I think his objective was the U.S. government needed to have more capable people working inside the government that came from science and technology. And he created this fantastic program which has had this impact over 50 years. That's a picture. I worked for a member of Congress who was not a scientist, although he loved scientists. He loved science. And so for me, it was an eye-opening to see what it's actually like working inside the legislative branch of government. I also wanted to mention, I mentioned some of those scientists who were involved in these back-channel discussions with scientists in other countries dealing with things like nuclear weapons. The 2 pictured there were very much involved in that. I was very fortunate to have them as mentors. The one in the front is Paul Doty, a world-class biochemist at the time, and Wolfgang Panofsky, great experimental physicist who ran the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. Both of them never served inside the government, but they were heavily involved in these dialogues. So I consider them to be great scientist diplomats. And what I really wanted to illustrate for some of the the younger people in the audience, it's really important to have good mentors in your career, people that you look up to, can provide inspiration by the models that they created during their own careers. I'll mention two others when I go on about other scientists who did similar things. Well, after being a professor, I was at the University of Tennessee teaching physics, but directing several research centers, mainly involved with environmental and energy issues at the time. But I was asked to go on a sabbatical to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, which is an organization, not part of the government, but was actually created by a resolution of the U.S. government back during, and again, a very difficult time in the United States during the American Civil War. This was in 1863, and Congress created what was the body then of sort of honoring distinguished scientists. It was actually naval scientists who actually started it. But at the same time, it had the provision that's on this phrase. It turned out to be very important. It said that the National Academy of Sciences, when called upon by any department of the government, investigate, examine, and report upon any subject of science or art. What they actually meant by art in those days was the technological arts, the applied sciences, technology, engineering, for example. Well, growing out of that, they also said about it shouldn't receive any compensation. The academies were able to get over that. And now there are 3 academies, science, engineering, and medicine. Now, besides electing distinguished people in those 3 different areas, the main role in terms of the government and society is providing expert studies and advice on all kinds of issues where knowledge from science and technology is relevant and important. The government doesn't always follow the advice. Sometimes they don't like the advice, but it does turn out to have a significant impact over time. Now the academies do roughly 200 studies a year. I first went there just to head the international programs on sabbatical and ended up being asked to stay, and I stayed for 20 years overseeing these expert studies. And although 200 studies are done a year, mainly dealing with domestic issues that are important, where scientific and technological information is important, but also we conducted a fairly active program of engagement with science communities in other countries. And it sort of had 2 purposes. One purpose to help advance science, but it had a second purpose because the U.S. academies had developed this role of advising the U.S. government. We thought it was important to actually help other science communities, if they were very interested in doing the same thing, become more important advisors, not only to their government, but also to their public on all the issues that affect their societies where science, technology, information is important and relevant. So just to give you examples of just a few things to illustrate. Here's one on energy futures and urban air pollution. That was between the U.S. and the Chinese Academy of Sciences and Engineering. The African Science Academy Development Initiative was actually funded by a foundation, the Gates Foundation, for a decade to help the science academies in Africa become more important advisors to their governments and their people on health issues. Here's an interesting one. Science is a gateway to understanding in Tehran. With the encouragement of both the U.S. government and the Iranian government were not getting along at all well, but in the early 2000s, they encouraged the science communities in both countries to have an active engagement, to have 4 or 5 workshops a year, not dealing with nuclear issues, but dealing with earthquake protection, with dealing with health issues, environmental restoration. And so we got to know very well the scientists in Iran and the connections to the scientists in the United States. Although later, of course, there was what is called the Iran nuclear agreement between the 2 governments. Although these workshops did not deal, as I said, with nuclear issues, it turns out the goodwill that was created through that at the time helped to facilitate, which then became active diplomatic engagements. I was just going to show one study that I think it came out about 2006. We were asked by the intelligence agencies, they took 6 countries around the world that had very ambitious programs for advancing their science and technology. And what we were asked was, what are the factors, the indicators that might tell us which countries might be most successful in accomplishing their very ambitious goals? And it was a very expert committee, came from different fields, experts. They looked at all kinds of data, publications, patents, you name it. They came to a conclusion that really surprised them. They found that the single most important factor in trying to determine which countries might be most successful in achieving their ambitious plans had more to do with the culture of the country than it did with any other single factor. I also wanted to show two other great science diplomats. Millie Dressel-House is known as the Queen of Carbon. She actually did serve in the U.S. government briefly in the Department of Energy, but most of her career was outside of government. She was another scientist who used her career, her recognition, her great accomplishments as a tool to try to strengthen relations between countries. Another mentor, Sherry Rowland. He's one of the three scientists who received a Nobel Prize for alerting the world to what chlorofluorocarbons could do to the ozone layer, which actually helped lead to the Montreal Protocol. Again, he used his great reputation around the world to again advance connections, science engagement between the United States and other countries. There were two studies that came out during my tenure. I was there at the academies for 20 years, but two studies both came out in 1999, both not funded by the government, but both actually by individuals who thought it was very important for the science institutions in the U.S. To provide advice on this role. Here's one called The Pervasive Role of Science, Technology, and Health and Foreign Policy Imperatives for the Department of State. The feeling that science and technology were so important, affecting international relations, that the U.S. State Department, our foreign ministry, had to improve its capacity to deal with these issues by having more people, in particular inside the Department of State, that had backgrounds in science and technology. When I retired from the academies in 2011, one of the recommendations in their report, I should have mentioned that one done in 1999, was the State Department should create the position of the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State, but not to create it as a political position, create a non-political position that to serve a maximum of 3 years, and the person would go from one administration to the next, one Secretary of State to the next. And when I retired in 2011, I was asked to undertake that role. So I was the fourth person to take this role of the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State. That was actually back in the Obama administration days, Secretary Clinton and Secretary Kerry. My term was sort of halfway between the two of those. And that was sort of, for me, it was kind of a golden time in terms of scientific engagement between countries. Going back a decade, things look a little bit different now because of the geopolitics of the world. And one thing that really stuck out to me was, I think I interacted with 70 or so countries during that period. Every single country I dealt with, the first thing they want to talk about, whether it's the most advanced country technologically or whether it was an emerging country building their capabilities in science and technology, they all want to talk about this topic number one, how science and technology can be used for innovation, to build up domestic capacity, for the country to be able to compete in this globalized, interconnected, very competitive world. And so at least in that era, I think in some sense there's still a lot of that going on, but that was the topic that most countries were interested in. Actually, during that period when I was there, one of the first foreign trips I took was to South Africa, accompanying the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, which is the American funding organization for basic research, one of the American funding organizations for basic research. It's actually here in Turkey now, talking with bright Turkish scientists and students who have good ideas, and they're quite willing to fund them and actually facilitate collaboration between American and Turkish scientists. And that's what I was doing back in South Africa when I first became a big fan of the way that AFOSR operated, being able to fund foreign scientists and collaborations, doing open, not classified, not restricted at all, open research that everyone can benefit from. Let me talk just a little bit about science diplomacy, because I said it's kind of a vague, amorphous term. So we used to talk about science and diplomacy, science and international affairs. It became very popular when the "and" was dropped, and so it became a fad, I would say, for scientists, thinking, oh boy, we're really involved in diplomacy, with science diplomacy. But what does it encompass? If you look at it very generally, it's about how science engagement can help, whether it's intentional or not, to advance what you might call diplomatic goals. But also includes very much how the diplomats, political leaders, can actually advance the worldwide scientific enterprise, which is equally important. The scientists in the United States know that there are many bright people around the world doing world-class things. And if you're going to stay near the front, you have to work with the best people no matter where they are in the world. And so international scientific collaboration has become even more important for almost all scientific fields for U.S. Scientists. And often there are impediments to scientific collaboration, whether it's by things like acquiring visas or constraints that are put on. And so diplomats also have a role, I think, for trying to help remove some of these hurdles when it can be done to help facilitate scientific engagement. The last one I mentioned there, which was one that an aspect that I like, sometimes with the problems that are being dealt with are so complicated and so difficult, they're impossible to make progress solely from diplomacy and engagement between governments. But the one thing about science technology we know, it can create sometimes new avenues that can make progress. And those developments by science technology can actually leap over, we call it leapfrog, leap over the obstacles that have been hindering actually agreements between diplomats. So I think we always have to remember that sometimes we can have new avenues to help solve our problem that come from the advances in science and technology. Well, I learned, when I went to serve in the State Department, and I learned a lot. It was almost like being a graduate student again. Of course, it was a whole new list of acronyms I had to learn, but I became a big fan of both the real diplomats who really tackle the hard issues, but also the value that having trained scientists, engineers actually serving inside the State Department. Through that AAAS program, now there are roughly 20 to 25 new fellows that come in every year. And I think for former fellows who have actually decided to make a career inside the State Department, they're well over 100 now that came through that program. The other study in 1999 that had a big influence, at least on my career, again funded by an individual, not funded by the government. The title of it was Our Common Journey of Transition Towards Sustainability. It was to look at what is the role of science and technology for actually facilitating moving to more sustainable development world. And there was a famous report done by the UN in the 1980s called the Brundtland Report, called Our Common Future, which sort of provided a definition of sustainable development. It's kind of lasted over that time. And this title, Our Common Journey, was sort of play on those words, a journey. And the idea is that in order to make progress on sustainable development, it really requires a journey, a path of learning by doing, interaction between the science community and civil society and governments, learning what's working, what's not working. Science can sometimes provide the information, the data to tell us how corrections need to be made. So it's really being able to make progress towards sustainable development. It really is a journey, a path that has to be developed through engagement between the scientific community, civil society, and political leaders. Well, anyway, when I retired from the National Academies in 2011, and went to the State Department from 2011 to 2014, during that period, the countries of the world were negotiating over what has been called the UN 2030 Agenda, which ended up ultimately resulting in 17 sustainable development goals, cover the waterfront. Many advanced countries were trying to minimize the number. They thought if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. They were also trying to minimize the cost that they thought it was going to be required for funding the UN to work on some of these things. But I think it turned out the right way, which many other countries were including. Now it includes almost everything. It includes the goal. In fact, they're often called the goals: people, prosperity, planet, partnerships, and peace. So any country, any person can probably find within this framework something that they think is very important. So I think it's actually a very aspirational, inspirational program. The real challenge is trying to figure out how you turn the wonderful rhetoric of the Sustainable Development Goals into to real action that can actually produce results. When the governments were negotiating this, they knew science and technology was important, and science, technology, innovation. They didn't know quite how to harness it, and so they created this component of the UN 2030 Agenda, something called the Technology Facilitation Mechanism. It's got this strange name, but it's essentially how can science and technology facilitate making progress on the goals, and they created a 10-person advisory committee to help working with UN agencies and other international agencies. The advisory committee was composed of not people in governments, but they came from the scientific community, civil society, the private sector. And so for the first 2 years, from 2016 to 2018, I was co-chair of this advisory committee, but I've been involved to some extent with this role of science technology for sustainable development ever since. And the main thing that we were trying to work on in those days, at least through this advisory committee, was how do we turn things into real action and progress. And I just wanted to highlight one of the things that we championed, which actually has turned out to be an important initiative called STI for SDG roadmaps. And let me tell you what that is. STI stands for Science, Technology, Innovation. SDGs for Sustainable Development Goals. Most countries have a national plan where they focus on things that are important to that country. Many, particularly the science and technology agencies, have a plan for building up their capabilities and competence in science and technology. And many countries also have a plan for how they accomplish certain, if not all, of the Sustainable Development Goals. In these roadmaps is taken from the technology sector. The roadmap, again, is a path by which you learn by doing. You set out concrete goals, what you're going to do. You evaluate where you're making progress. You go back and revise it, but you're aiming at a long-term objective. And so these STI for SDG roadmaps is the roadmap for the intersection of these three components, the national goals, the goals for building capabilities in science and technology, and for making progress on the SDGs. And the positive thing that came out of this, several advanced countries, not including the United States, to my embarrassment, but several advanced countries, international agencies to assist what were called pilot countries who had buy-in from the top of government, as well as from civil society and the sector of their society to try to develop their STI for SDG roadmaps. And the first 6 that undertook this, I believe 3 were in Africa, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Kenya, include India and Serbia, and Ukraine. So this was all created in sort of 2019. One lesson, and progress has been made by a number of these, but one lesson that comes from this that shows you that probably the greatest challenge to sustainable development is from conflicts and wars. The fact that Ukraine is one of these countries. Ethiopia has been involved in the civil war. There are roughly 18 or 19 other sort of emerging countries who are very interested in developing their roadmaps and what they might accomplish. But nevertheless, we shouldn't forget that there are other things that can have a tremendous impact, no matter how good our plans are. And wars and conflicts is sort of at the top of the list. I just wanted to listen. I know you're not going to be able to read a list there. A number of the reports that came out during this period, one done by a colleague who was on this 10-member group, who's from Austria, had a series of reports dealing, people sort of cut the Sustainable Development Goals in different ways that science and technology can interact and actually be able to increase the synergies and reduce the conflicts between different goals. And those series of reports on the world in 2050, it sort of cut things in 6 different ways, which I thought were particularly nice. All these things are available on the web. If anyone's interested in my slides afterwards, they're free to have. I can give you references. One of the other things that was recognized at the time when I was in the State Department, also at the UN, was the challenges and opportunities of emerging technologies. Now I think of those challenges have become even more apparent, dealing with all the technology we might list under that list right there. I suppose many of you probably saw a couple days ago the world's scientific research leaders in artificial intelligence came out with a statement. They really said the governments of the world need to figure out how to regulate AI, because they saw that it presented what they said was an existential risk to humanity, comparable to nuclear weapons and to pandemics. Now that caught up a lot of attention when the people that are advancing this technology. And we know that the companies that are involved in this are trying to move very fast for their own economic competitive reasons. And it's truly a great challenge to figure out how do we benefit from the advances that come from having things like AI, as well as the same thing, controlling what could be really enormous risk for societies. Back when I was in the State Department, I interacted with the intelligence agencies trying to predict what some of the possibilities might be with advances in technology. And actually, there's a very interesting report that the U.S. intelligence agency, a public report done every 4 years, comes out right after the U.S. presidential election, called the Global Trends Report, again, all available on the web. But they're looking not only what science and technology might influence in pathways for the world, but also looking at geopolitics and many other things, interesting things to read at the time, see how accurate they might be, and try to predict how the future unfolds. But it's very hard to predict, particularly with science and technology, what they might be. I do know from my experience a decade ago, working, we were trying to anticipate what might happen with social media. Totally underestimated the impact of social media. It might be a disruptive force on society as opposed to just providing benefits through more people being able to interact with each other. So it's difficult to figure, even in the short run, what all the impacts are of these technologies that are moving so fast. But anyway, all of this has caught the attention of diplomats, now probably heightened over what's happened over the last decade. So now geopolitics. We know the world is actually quite different now than it was 10 years ago when I was inside the U.S. government. I just listed some of the things. When I was at the UN for the technology facilitation mechanism at the UN, besides having an advisory group, it also has an annual meeting at the UN called the Multi-Stakeholder Forum, which includes not only diplomats, but people coming from the science community, coming from the private sector, from governments talking about all these issues using science to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And in that meeting, they were talking about the 3 C's that have disrupted things. The 3 C's obviously are COVID, the climate change, and conflict. Didn't say war, but it goes all the way from conflict to wars, as well as the competition that has resulted from that, which has truly set back progress in terms of sustainable development. But if you look at the changes in geopolitics, the pandemic, right now in the United States, the one thing that unites U.S. politicians, we have big political divides in the U.S., the one thing that unites them anyway is this concern with competition with China. When I was in the national academies, my job was to help facilitate scientific cooperation with China. I still think it's really important, particularly in basic research, for the U.S. to collaborate with China. In fact, in terms of joint papers and publications in basic research, for U.S. scientists, China is the #1 foreign country in terms of that collaboration, in terms of just numbers. But now it's a big factor anyway in the impact of this competition. Of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, going to be a long time before scientific engagement returns between the U.S., for example, and Russia. I talked about the advances that I thought science diplomacy had made with the Soviet Union, Russia, with China, and with Iran. Geopolitics and I think progress was made. Geopolitics has turned all 3 of those in the other direction. Although I still think it's important to use science diplomacy as a tool again. Well, one thing that science diplomacy can do, if a country like the U.S. is trying to perhaps provide influence in some way of another country, a good way to do it sometimes is engagement with their scientific community. Their scientific community has a lot more effect on their government than it is the U.S. government trying to influence them. I think it's the scientific community of the countries actually, I think, is a very positive force in both cases and a good thing, both for that country as well as, for example, the United States. Increasingly globalization, so there's going to be costs, economic costs, supply chain concerns, economic distresses around the world. We know in terms of even in terms of Sustainable Development Goals, democracy was not one of the goals. That was never going to be one that they were going to agree with. But even in our democracies, including in the United States, there's been a tendency to tilt more to autocratic leaders. And then climate change coming even faster. I think one of the the big contributions of science diplomacy was the working of the scientific community to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, working with world leaders, which led to the Paris Climate Agreement. But the one thing that we've learned in looking at the IPCC reports that have come out over the years, it gets worse every time. Things are coming faster than what were anticipated. So I truly believe climate change present an existential threat to the world and our environment, our planet. Let me just talk briefly I didn't say exactly when I started, but I'll try to wrap up relatively quickly. The response of the United States, particularly to the competition with China, I said it's the one thing that's sort of uniting the political factions in the U.S. It's also meant that in some sense, in terms of, and there were legitimate concerns about some of the practices, particularly in China, that occurred in terms of stealing technology, in some cases, not often I think through a scientific exchange, but in some cases there, which sort of heightened these concerns. But my fear, my personal fear, is that there'll be an overreaction in the U.S., that right now there's the security concerns, and then how the U.S. has benefited from active scientific engagement around the world with many countries, particularly in basic research. And so there's this balance between the two, putting out hurdles to deal with security concern. For example, preventing collaboration with some countries, or producing more areas that have in the past been published in the open literature but now may be restricted, and what is called controlled but unclassified areas of basic research. So my fear in part is the balance may tip over a little bit, going too far and ignore the benefits the United States has gotten from having very active scientific engagement, particularly in basic research around the world. And they've read a number of studies done by influential organizations that have titles like Protecting U.S. Technological Advantage, Balancing Openness and Security, this in case across the Department of Defense academic enterprise, which just illustrates that this issue has become a dominant one. So let me go back to science diplomacy for a moment, talking about the pros and cons. I mentioned how some of the advances that I think were facilitated by science diplomacy, now there have been setbacks coming from particularly the geopolitical concerns. I mentioned in terms of great advances, I mentioned the arms control treaties in the 90s, the Montreal Protocol, dealing with chlorofluorocarbons, and then recently there was the Kigali Amendment that was adopted. That required not only advances made by the scientists that got the Nobel Prize, but it also included the work of companies that developed new refrigerants that did not use the chlorofluorocarbons, but also included very competent diplomats who negotiated this treaty, which was approved back in, so it really required a partnership in order to make that progress. I mentioned the IPCC. The fact, when the scientists finished the IPCC report, then there is also a report for decision makers, which is actually negotiated between the governments and the scientists. But it's a very interesting process of how, of course, again, the challenge is turning the rhetoric in the treaties into real action. That's not an easy thing to do. But in terms of this partnership between the science community at a global level and countries through the framework that was created, I think has been very important. So I just mentioned, we all know politics is, in the short run, is going to have a bigger impact than science diplomacy ever will. But I think, as I said in that last bullet right there, current tensions don't obscure the fact that it's important to continue the science engagement. It's also a way, perhaps, to influence countries in a more positive, constructive direction, and perhaps reach those opportunities that might be able to leap over some of the problems. This is just that I'm going to have, my last slide has a couple articles. My most recent one is dealing with this issue of trying to preserve the advantages that come to the United States from having very active collaboration in basic research around the world. Actually, this week, although it's not there in person, the Chinese Ministry of Science and Technology and their academy asked me to give a keynote address on science diplomacy like here, but because of the pandemic at the time, this was last October, they just wanted me to record it and send them the text, which I did. Their meeting, even in Beijing, got postponed from October to November. They got postponed again because of the pandemic, but actually occurred this past week, on Monday, I believe, this week when I was here in Turkey. So the Chinese scientific community is also very concerned about the impact on reduced collaboration as well. And I mentioned the one thing that worries me the most is there could be new restrictions put on what has been open basic research that may no longer be possible, even between scientists in different countries, or even closing off to the open literature certain types of research. This is just continuing that. you know, it's back in the Reagan administration, a very conservative American president, when they laid out this policy of the federal government, which has lasted all this time, that said, to the maximum extent possible, the products of fundamental research, that is basic research, remain unrestricted, and when national security requires control, the appropriate mechanism is classification. So that's actually, this was actually kind of the gold standard of, that provided, I think, great advantages for the U.S. in the world, at least for U.S. collaboration in science. And now there's this potential that some of this may be changed. And so I think my own view is I think the science community in the U.S. has to work with the government to make sure they understand what the downside would be for U.S. science, for U.S. society, if we do things that are counterproductive. Oh, I won't go into this one, but if you read the article I had at the end, that National Academy report where I used to work produced a report which I actually criticize in this, so that's sort of what I do, because they laid out a solution to this problem was putting together a risk assessment approach, whole government approach of the U.S. agencies, which the way that they've discussed it, I think it would lead to a laborious process that would slow things down. I think the key thing, if the government wants to figure out what are the real concerns in a particular area, whether it's AI, robotics, you have to have the world leaders in that science interacting with the people in government so they can understand for that field what are the things that we might really need to worry about and might need to be restricted. If you can't have a universal risk assessment rule that can be applied, particularly when things are advancing so quickly in different fields. So what are my recommendations for, I don't like to give recommendations in other countries, but at least now I'm not in the government, I can recommend all I want. Whether they pay attention, of course, is another thing, but what would be my recommendations, at least for basic research for the United States? We increase our funding for basic research. I think all the benefits we achieve today in technologies mainly came from advances in basic research in the last century. I think we need to continue doing that. I need to increase our collaboration, particularly with our allied countries. But I think being careful, as I said, with our eyes wide open, continue our scientific collaborations, in this case between the U.S. and China. And it's really important, especially dealing with global challenges like climate change, and only with the U.S. and China working together on that are we going to be able to have potential solutions of what we should do. The last one right there is, I said, my view again, no need to fundamentally change the research strategy that the U.S. has employed, which has benefited our country so greatly. The last thing I wanted to mention, I co-chaired a report from the U.S. academies that came out at the end of last year, which is going back to sustainable development. It was called Operationalizing Sustainable Development. That's another way to say it was to try to stimulate action that can actually reach real results. And what we looked at in this report is particularly for a U.S. audience, but also looking at, I thought it was quite relevant in other places as well, looking at examples coming from around the world, not just the U.S., at the subnational level in particular, by cities, by civil society groups. They were actually doing concrete things. They were making progress in communities, for example, in the state or the city level. Things that not only can we learn from, but are actually moving things in the right direction. And the one unifying factor amongst all these different examples that we had was one of the most important ingredients was to actually have a dialogue between the science community and the local community. The science community trying to understand exactly what the local needs were and then figuring out solutions that might work together in these environments. So again, getting back to that topic that it's a journey of learning by doing, of interaction, is how progress can ultimately be made. It also has to be done, obviously, at the global level. Oh, I guess this is my last sort of concluding slide. I think, well, one of the reasons I think it's really important to maintain scientific engagement, I think one of the best things we can do is to create knowledge-based societies around the world. Science diplomacy can help to do that. If we're going to realize the benefits and minimize the risks of emerging technologies, science diplomacy can be a useful tool as well for working together on those challenges. And lastly, if we want to operationalize sustainable development, that is create real action to do this. Again, science diplomacy can be one of those tools, and working together, we can use it to make progress both for people as well as for our planet. And lastly, I just listed some of the you know, this little small publication in the AAAS called Science and Diplomacy Journal. It's all available for free on the web. It's not an academic journal. No one is going to get tenure based on this, but it's really to learn by seeing what is being done elsewhere by practitioners. It could be from the scientific community, from the diplomatic. They do interviews now with of the diplomats in Washington, talking about their home country and what is going on in terms of science and technology there. So I listen. So for me, it's kind of like a vanity press because I can do editorials every once in a while and give my own views. And in the last one I listed there was this one that I talked about, this precarious balance between research openness and security. And I should mention for the National Academy reports that I had up there, one of the things I'm most proud of during my tenure there, we actually now make all of the publications available to the world. They're free to download, which was not the case when I first went there. So if you're interested in any of the reports of national academies, you could access them for free via the web. So I'll end that. Now I look forward to, if we have time, I didn't have too much time to have you all ask me questions, although that's fine, but I would love to hear from you about what you think of the things that the scientific community needs to do to live up to its responsibilities to deal with all the challenges that the world is facing. It's important for our countries as well as for the world. So thank you very much. A real pleasure to be here.